There, that's better. Okay, good, good. I'm Tanya Murray with Oregon Tilth. Oregon Tilth is a nonprofit certifier, educator, and advocate for organic agriculture. And I work on the education team at Oregon Tilth, where I really am focused on developing tools and trainings to support farm viability. And I'm here today at the Seed Economics Intensive with support from the USDA's Risk Management Agency. My previous experience really includes management of diversified organic vegetable farms, where I really got to experience firsthand a lot of the challenges around running a economically sustainable farm business. And this experience really has informed much of the work that I've been doing around trying to support farmers like you to hopefully stay in business for the long term. So I'm really going to talk today about some very basic strategies for tracking labor on your farm, which I think will have some great tie-in to Travis's presentation today. So for many farms, and from my experience, labor tends to be one of the major costs that you face and really needs to be accounted for when you're developing enterprise budgets, as you saw, and determining just generally the viability of different crops and enterprises on your farm. And tracking the labor that goes in each specific crop that you grow can tend to be fairly challenging, as folks who have possibly experimented with this might have found. Whereas tracking records for inputs and even machinery, it does take some record keeping. There's, I think, more record keeping for those types of costs can happen in the off season with a few supporting records. Whereas with the labor, you really need to account for your time during the season when you're already the busiest on your farm. So over the past couple of years, in partnership with Oregon State University's Center for Small Farms and Community Food Systems, I have been leading the development of a program called the Cost Study Cohort Program, which is really a program that's focused on supporting diversified vegetable farmers with determining their crop-specific costs of production. And we really designed the program with a couple of major goals. And one of those was really to be able to hone in on those crop-specific labor costs, and also to really try to make the record keeping for those crops as achievable as possible while providing useful information, specifically about how much each crop is contributing to or detracting from your bottom line. We also wanted to provide some ability, and Travis mentioned this in his presentation, to look at what changes could be made to impact profitability. So basically, we just looked at some of the scenarios, so this ability to like run these what if scenarios. And the idea there, just in general with playing with enterprise budgets is, you know, every season on the farm is going to be different. And the idea that if you can play a little bit on paper to identify a plan at least where you look profitable, you have more chance of getting towards that plan than if you're not developing that plan. And it's usually easier to play with paper than to like do the whole season as your experiment. So trying to like, you know, develop some portion of a plan at least so you can identify how you could move forward. So the Cost Study Cohort Program is actually a 12 to 14 month long program, and it's based on using a costing system that we've developed, again, to look at crop-specific costs of production. And participants in this program access a few different online training modules which walk them through using the costing tool that we've developed. And the first section of module is the Track It section, and we're going to do a bit of a preview of that section today, and you'll actually do a bit of an exercise in that section. But the idea in that section is to start to identify exactly what kind of labor activities you are going to need to track on your farm during the season so that you can determine your crop-specific costs. And then following that, there is the Calculate It module where you learn to use a similar tool to what you saw today to actually calculate some crop-specific costs of production. And then finally, there's a section where you are learning how to do some analysis with the numbers that you have in front of you. So you're not just seeing what's losing money, but hopefully have some ideas on what to do with that in the analyze it part of the program. And it's sort of a framework for looking at those results. As we developed this program, we were really aware that the one piece of it was developing the costing tool, but a big part of it and another big challenge with it is I'm really trying to figure out how to support growers to get the record keeping done in season. So there's a few things that we've developed into the program to address that challenge. And one is that we've been offering the program in our pilots and now in our first year here in Oregon as a facilitated cohort model, with the idea being that you might be more likely to do things with a group of other farmers that are there for support and possibly some peer-to-peer accountability. And the facilitator's role in these cohorts is really to provide you with some structure and the space, and again, some further accountability to hopefully keep you going and keep you at it through the busy farming season. So I'm really telling you about this program today, partly just to give you some context for the specifics of the tracking section that I'm gonna go into in a minute, and also just to let you know about this program because we are currently offering it in Oregon and then looking to expand it into several Western states in 2019 and then nationally in 2020. And I'll have a slide at the end with some contact information if this is something that you're interested in being a part of in the future. So the approach for tracking labor that's really used in this cost study cohort program is doing time studies. And we already heard from someone, I think in the audience, who might be doing something of the sort. So by time studies, what I mean is that you literally go out and time yourself when you're doing an activity, not to do the time study specifically, but when you're actually going out to seed or irrigate or weed or whatever it is, and you're going to time yourself at that activity and look at the amount of time it takes to determine a standard rate for that activity in terms of time relative to a certain number of units, usually of space, maybe of crop, like pounds or grams or ounces or whatever it is. And then you can use those standard rates, those samplings that you develop, samplings that you do to develop standard rates, to apply those to the different crops you grow. So for example here, say you went out and you hoed some beds for 600 minutes, that's a long time, but it could be a whole group of people all together doing that. And you hoed about 300 bed feet, and I totally made these up so they're not based on any kind of reality, but you could then calculate a standard labor rate of 2 minutes per bed foot. And then you could take that labor rate and apply that to a specific crop that you grow. So in this case, if you had 1,000 bed feet of lettuce, then 2,000 minutes of labor for hoeing that crop. So a simple concept. And the thing that I really like about the time study approach and really want to emphasize is that it simplifies the labor tracking you do, because you are not tracking all of your labor all the time. And I think if there's anything you get out of anything I say, that's sort of the key piece, is the idea of looking at different activities and really focusing on the activity and realizing that, did the mic just change? Maybe I did. Realizing that the time that it takes to prep beds, for example, it doesn't matter what the crop's going to be. For a lot of other activities, that's true. For example, covering beds with row cover, setting up irrigation, a lot of things, it doesn't matter what the crop is. You're looking really just on the activity level. When you get to harvest and post-harvest, I would say that there's going to tend to be more crop by crop variability, and that's where it will make sense to establish some standard rates for different activities on a crop by crop basis. So that can be a long list, but it's also something you can work on developing over time. I think it's important to point out, because often when I explain this approach, people point this out, that you're not going to get an exact number for like this packet of seed costs this exact amount to grow. There's always going to be variability, but what you're going to get is a rough estimate that is going to be useful, and knowing the exact cost of every packet of seed probably not particularly feasible to actually get to that number. And one thing that I think is really important, and you can see where this connects, I think, with the scenario analysis that you looked at earlier, is this idea of establishing a range of rates, because, you know, again, there's going to be variability every season, but understanding what the slowest time for a task might be versus the fastest time for a task, and then being able to look at what are the impacts on ultimately on my profits for this crop, depending on where I am. And I think that can really help you hone in on what matters, because there may be things that, you know, yeah, there's a range, but it doesn't matter. And there may be other things where if it's taking me, you know, 4 times as long to weed, that all of a sudden this crop might actually not pencil out. So trying to get comfortable with that range, with that variability, is important, and understanding that you can actually use it as part of your analysis. So as you're doing your time studies, capturing those, you know, highs and lows is helpful. I also really like the time studies because beyond just doing the costing work, they can be a useful management tool for planning daily activities, and also for giving work crews like a benchmark for how long things should take. So knowing, like, do you have time to get a planting in by the end of the day with the number of people that you have before you have to turn the water on is helpful. And likewise, having worked on farm crews at some points in my life, knowing that I'd rather have someone tell me a target for planting is, you know, 1,000 plants an hour. I hope they don't say that, but versus, you know, just go faster, because just go faster is not always helpful. So those are some of the reasons that I think the time studies can be useful to use. I think I already sort of mentioned this, but a key piece with the time studies, and I'll give you a chance to all chime in on this, really is that the idea of plugging them into the budgets is exciting, but you have to actually get the data and get them done. And what I've seen from running some of these cohorts over the past few years is that the people that have had some success are people that have really taken the time before the season started to set up their systems for doing the record keeping, and so that they're not using any mental energy to figure out what they're going to keep track of once the season really gets busy. So really the time it takes to write things down isn't that much, but it's that like idea of like keeping this in your mind to remember to do it that can be a challenge. And so as much as you can really make it a habit on your farm and integrate it into your day-to-day activities, I think that's where you're going to have the most success. So to do that, a couple of recommendations. One is going to be to, again, really identify exactly what you need to keep track of, and we'll spend a little time doing that today. Also thinking about how you're going to keep track of that information. So I like that someone already brought up using stopwatches and Google Docs to do that. There's no one right way to do it, but you know, understanding whether you're going to use little notebooks that are all over the farm in the field, or clipboards, or your phone, or whatever it is that's going to work for you, but having that system and having it very clearly set up is going to make a big difference. I also think thinking a little bit, if you have an operation that's not just you doing all the work, about who is going to be responsible for doing the time studies is important, because there might be someone that, you know, does all the tractor work, so they would naturally make sense to be the one that does keep track of those activities. And you also might want to do a little bit of prioritizing. So there's obviously some activities that you're only going to do at some points in the season, and others that you might have multiple opportunities to capture a time study on. So being clear about which ones you're going to prioritize at which points in time. And I guess one other thing in terms of the how that I think is useful, and this could probably be a bit of a debate, but I would say that I see a lot of value in using phones and computers and whatnot, because you can eliminate some of the duplication of record keeping, which is great. But I also see how part of it is actually remembering to do the time study. And so if you can create a system for record keeping that really triggers you to remember to do the time study itself, that is really important. So for example, if I were going to try to collect time studies on direct seeding, and I go out to the field to direct seed, and I'm using a little notebook that I keep, in a bucket with my seed rollers and seeds and whatnot, I'm a little more likely by seeing that to be triggered to remember to do it. Whereas with the phone, I think you just have to be more mindful of actually remembering to pull your phone out, because it probably won't remind you to actually do the time study. So thinking about your systems up front is really important. And then the last thing I want to say is just that it's really worth thinking about starting small with this process. I've done a few workshops on this and had a lot of people get excited about tracking everything this season, and then getting to July and feeling a little bit good. And so I think giving yourself permission to take a few years to gather your data is a realistic way to think about it, and is probably more likely to get you there. And the beauty of the time studies really is that they don't expire. They're not tied to a particular season. So if you don't change your production system for a specific activity, that rate should hold true and be applicable to future planning. So I think there's a lot of value in using them in that way, and just being okay with that being a slower process. So it's great everyone is awake, and so there's a little bit of time, I think, to go ahead and have you do a little bit of a brainstorm. And I'm totally serious about this, because I think it's February, so you can start to make your list up a little bit. So my suggestion is that you take a few minutes right now to actually brainstorm just 3 activities that you might think about tracking this particular farm season. And you can work with folks at your table if that's helpful, and think a little bit about what units you might use, because that's one of the pieces that you don't want to have to start figuring out when you get out to the field. There's not one right answer for that, and you saw with Travis's tool that usually you can use conversions to make those line up with the tool that you're using, but the idea being that you can't just write down how long something takes, because the time alone isn't meaningful. So you need the time relative to some number of units for the time study. And then really, again, thinking about those specific systems that you're going to use in the field to record the information, and the who and the when that is important. So we'll give you a little bit of time and then come back in a few minutes and hear from a few folks about what they came up with, and if there's some questions, take those. All right. So we're going to come back together for a few minutes before the break. And then at the break, if you want to keep working on this, that's just great. But we're going to come back together, and it would be fun to hear a few activities perhaps that people came up with, and maybe how they are thinking about tracking them in the field. And yeah, we'll do that. Did anyone come up with anything? Come on, someone out there. Yes.
Oh, I gotta talk. All right. I got 3 labor activities to track. One is weeding specifically of vegetables, planting of the vegetables, and tilling. And now tilling can be crossed with weeding, but there's also the prep tilling that goes in there anyway. And there's a boundary around the whole of each plot that gets tilled anyway.
Right.
So I have 3 separate activities. I will track them in minutes. And how I'll record time. I do not keep a phone on me where I work because sometimes I have cattle issues where I get wet and the phone will be trashed. So, but clocks are handy because I'm close to a building in each field. I am responsible for all of this, and when it will get done at the end of each day. So I will use the notebook that would be out in a pail with a cover on it.
Okay.
And then I can take that to the house to the spreadsheet every day.
Okay. And when you're thinking about weeding, like you'll do it during the season that's,
Yes.
there's more weeds. and weeding for you, do you weed different ways? Like if you're hand weeding, maybe sometimes do you hoe versus actually hand weeding?
There's both.
Both.
Depends on which plot.
Right.
And some plots have different weeds that are more prevalent where I have to, or if it's carrots when they're little, I gotta get in there with my fingers for the first time. Once they get so big, I don't worry about it.
Yeah. So with hand weeding, for example, it might be useful to establish a rate for, you could call it, hand weeding direct seeded crops. And then, you'd know that that was the rate that activity took. And then, maybe you'd apply it to carrots, but maybe you also grow beets and parsnips. And so you could use that same rate for different activities. And again, that's a really good one where I totally get that sometimes it takes longer than others depending on a lot of different variables. So, starting to understand what are the high and low ends of that range so that you can really understand worst and best case scenarios, and maybe make some tornadoes, that kind of thing. That was new to me, but it was fun. So yeah, understanding again that possibility of where you could be on that spectrum. And then your units, you said minutes, but what would be your unit of space? Bed feet or acres or row feet?
Row feet.
Row feet. Okay, cool. Thank you. Anyone else want to offer up something they came up with?
Are you trying to go in order of these questions?
Sure.
Okay. Well, I was gonna jump in the middle.
You can jump, whatever works.
So last year was my first year even attempting record keeping, and it was definitely a learning curve. And I found myself using a shorthand pretty often in my little notebook, and then not really filling out that shorthand. I don't know what that 5 minutes was or what that bag was, and so just one little innovation we just came up with was maybe have a whiteboard in the field. Even you can put electrical tape and make yourself a form that then goes back to the field station. So you're not carrying your year's data with you into the field where it gets dirty and wet.
Right.
But then you're forced to translate that data into a more legible format that stays safer from the field.
That's great. I'm also a really big fan of laminators. So laminating a piece of paper and then using grease pens with Listo leads are good, which those are actually they stay on for I'd probably still transfer them, but they do stay on for longer and are harder to you have to use some elbow grease to get them off, but they work in really wet and really dirty conditions. So thank you. Looks like there's another.
We use another one of those apps too. There's one called Toggle. That was what I was going to grab.
I've heard of that one.
And we use it often because it's something that most of us have a phone in the field, and you just push a play button and you can put in the rate and same thing. It's probably a similar app.
And does anyone that does use a phone specifically for time studies have a suggestion for everyone around how you do remember to pull your phone out? Is it just practice, or how does that work for you? Other thoughts on what you might track, or just general thoughts on how to make this work?
I actually did some of these time capturing on the farm I worked on, and Tanya gave me a couple pointers that really helped out in what we did. And what I did personally is I had a stopwatch and my little notebook, and I would do that. I got in the habit of doing that pretty quick, and the stopwatch was good for me because I could hang it on my neck and I didn't have to dig my phone out and drop it, and especially when you're driving a tractor, stuff like that. It's better to just have a $3 something that can get crushed. And so I used my notebook, and then I would rip the pages off at the end of the day or the week and just put them in a folder. And for other folks, I would give them a time card, not a time card, but a index card that said the activity and the time and you can just give that with a stopwatch to somebody else once they get the gist of how to do it, and then they give it back to you. You have a little paper record. And then once a week, I would enter my notepads and all the index cards into the tool. And that was just a good way to, that was just, I guess what I'm trying to say is good pointers for how to make it a habit and how to, you know, who's going to be responsible, like who's going to enter the data, and don't wait till the end of the year to enter the data because no one's going to want to do that. But try to get into the habit of not only capturing the time, but entering it regularly so you don't lose your time captures, or they're not in your pocket and you get soaked and then you can't read them, but get into some sort of habit or make a system that works on multiple levels for the activities.
Thank you.
All right, does anybody else have questions? Yes. Yes is the answer.
Thanks, this is great. It's so important. On our farm, one thing that I found that's really helpful is to get multiple people doing time studies of the same task, to get a sense of not what the range is under different conditions, but what the range is with different humans.
Yep.
And we're really transparent and pretty driven on our farm. And so if someone's faster than somebody else, they're definitely going to tell them. Mm-hmm. And in the spirit of, how did you do that that fast?
Right. Yeah.
What I find about that's helpful is that it's real-time feedback, because many of these tasks that we're doing throughout the entire season in a lot of cases, and it's nice to not wait until the next year to do it faster.
Right.
You can try to do it right then. The other thing is when we're doing something with the tractor or harrowing or whatever it is, we try to do as many it's nice to have a big block of the activity to do, to then divide down. So if you're harrowing 20 acres, you have a better picture of what the per acre rate is because you have less percentage of the time in setting up the harrows.
Right.
Or that kind of thing. And it doesn't translate to then what harrowing an acre is. You have to discount it a little bit, or add it on up a little bit. But anyway, I just found that to be really helpful.
Yeah, and I think that point around like the real-time opportunity is really important. And I mean, really, when you, at the end of the day, when you look at these numbers, if you're looking for somewhere that, you know, you have a crop that isn't where you want it to be at, and looking at like, where can I make improvements? You know, one of the places is going to be essentially in like technique and training. And so, you know, here's a place where you can immediately be looking at like, how are we doing this activity? And maybe it's like, oh, we could mechanize it more. But maybe even before that, it's like we could actually, you know, just train people or train ourselves to have a better, you know, specific technique of doing that activity, whether it's harvest or, you know, weeding, ergonomics, or whatever that is. So it can really shine a light on some of those cost structure, labor cost structure elements. So
this assumes you also have SOPs, you know, standard operating procedures for each task. So that when you have multiple people doing it, the variance in time isn't because they're all doing it different ways.
Right.
Except if some people need to be empowered to come up with better ways. The SOP is a floor, right?
Yes.
So
Great, thank you. And here's some information for contacting me and learning more about the Cost Study program if you want to get in touch, or I'll be around at the break. So.